Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 12. We're talking about fossils and phylogenies. Just one lecture this week. All right, so to start, I'm going to have a couple things to say about your phylogeny presentations. I went over your bibliographies in homework 3, so you'll have specific feedback and your grade in Moodle, so please check that out soon. And then we're going to discuss fossils, the fossil record, and we're going to have fun with phylogenetics. And we'll end the lecture with a note on why phylogenies are important and a couple book recommendations in case you need something more to do. So this would have been a series of lectures if we were face-to-face in class. So we have a couple things we're covering during this lecture. So we're going to describe how fossils form and the different kinds of fossils that we see. We're also going to look back in Earth's history and look at how many mass extinction events we've experienced on Earth after a certain period of time. Then we'll transition to phylogenetics. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to define phylogeny and phylogenetic tree. You guys have seen these in your research, so you'll be pros. You'll also describe the following components of a phylogenetic tree. We'll talk about the root, what a branch is, what a node is, and what an outgroup is. You'll use outgroups, and you'll find outgroups in your lab this week. You'll differentiate between ancestral and derived traits, and our last goal for this lecture is to define a couple terms. So the idea of monophyly, paraphyly, polyphyly, and what a synapomorphy is. Okay, so with that, we'll start with our presentations. So the first one of 2 presentations is due this Sunday. There will be a spot in Moodle for the slides themselves and a spot in Moodle for your presentation. So please refer back to that document. Please let me know if you have any questions along the way. I'm super happy to conference with you guys this week before you turn in your first 5-minute presentation. So looking at your questions, thank you guys for submitting those. It was really helpful to see where you guys were in your project. If you need help kind of figuring out the overall tree of life, please start with your textbook. So there's a really good comprehensive tree of all of your groups on pages 702 to 703. So crack open that textbook, take a look. There's also information on your individual groups. So you might have to look in the index for the specific one or just flip through the different chapters, but there's a series of chapters in your book about the diversity of life. So please look in your book if you haven't done so. That might help point you in the right direction if you need a little bit more guidance. And please, if that's not helping, let me know right away. I'm happy to Skype, Zoom, whatever media platform you want to use. That's all to say about your presentations. I think you guys are on the right track. You're doing good. It's a challenging project, and you guys are doing great. Let me know if you need anything. So with that, we're going to dig into the topics for today. So we're going to look at the fossil record and then some more specific information on phylogenies. You've been seeing them in your research, and now we'll get some more background. The most helpful thing to get this information across is if you've at least glanced at these pages in your book. So go ahead and push pause, come back to this video later after looking through page 496 through 513. You don't have to read it in depth, even if you're just flipping through the pages and checking out the figures, reading those figure captions, you should be all set. Okay, so now that you're back, we can continue with the lecture. So the fossil record is this beautiful detail. It represents what we know about life on Earth over millions and millions of years. So most of what we know about the history of life on Earth has come from the fossil record. But we don't have a comprehensive view of everything that lived on Earth. So only certain animals, plants, etc. have become fossilized. There's specific conditions that lead things to becoming fossils. And we think we only have 1% of everything that lived on planet Earth in the fossil record. So what goes into determining if something becomes a fossil? Well, there's a couple of things that are, a couple characteristics that are typical of things that have become fossilized. So if you are an animal or some kind of organism with a really soft, squishy body, so like a jellyfish, for example, or a slug or something along those lines, you are much less likely to make it into the fossil record. So things that are very soft, things that decay really fast, that can get squished, don't fossilize very well. So if you have bones, if you have a hard exoskeleton, if you have a shell, something like that, those are much more likely to get fossilized. Likewise, if you're living in different environments, you have a different chance of becoming a fossil. So if you live in a very dry region, you're less likely to fossilize. And the reason why that is if you live in a more wet habitat, you're more likely to be in a situation where you're covered with these different layers of sediment to protect that body from being decayed or eaten or otherwise gotten rid of. So along those lines of being kind of layered underneath, if it's in a habitat that is buried quickly, you're much more likely to make it into the fossil record. So if you stay on the surface, or if you're unprotected from the elements, you can decay, other things can come along and scavenge. So if you're buried quickly, and then over time, different layers are deposited, you are much more likely to become a fossil. And so here's kind of a visual representation of that. So my laser here. So if you are an organism that has died, we're in a wet environment and we have a nice skeletal system. Over time, you're quickly covered. Your flesh goes away, but that skeleton stays intact. Over long periods of time, so millions and millions of years, we get these layering of different rocks. This is that's how you make sedimentary rocks, just different layers that form over a long period of time. So you have this compression. You're protected underneath all of these rock layers. And again, over millions and millions of years, sometimes that rock gets eroded away. Sometimes the earth moves, something happens, and scientists can then excavate those remains. So not only is it the chance of being fossilized, it's also the chance of actually finding it and discovering it. So that's why we have a very small and skewed sense of the fossil record. Even though it's only a small percentage, we know a lot from fossils. So here's a beautiful panorama of different organisms. You can see some of them are very complete. It's not just animals that get fossilized, but plants as well. So even some delicate structures can defeat the odds and be permanently added to the fossil record. Okay, so these are probably typical images you might think of when we think of fossils, but there's actually a diversity of different kinds of fossils that we can use to learn about the organisms that lived a very long time ago. So one of those first fossil types is a cast fossil. So if you've ever broken a limb or needed a cast, right, it's the same idea. So something has completely covered an organism, and then over time, that individual organism decayed, but that cast stayed behind. So in this case, the layer of rock that was laid over these strange fossils in Kansas has preserved kind of that outside structure. So something decomposes and is replaced by minerals. Okay, so a cast fossil. Another type of fossil is a compression fossil. So it shows the outline rather than the actual organism itself. So if you've ever stuck your hand in mud or if you in cement or concrete, you have made a compression fossil. So often these form that sedimentary rock, like that image from earlier, those different layers forming on top. This is when we see the outline. So a compression fossil is when you've compressed the organism's information, that shape, into some rock, and it's preserved. And then the last type of fossil we're going to talk about is a trace fossil. So this shows indirect evidence of life. So instead of being an outline or a cast or something that's been mineralized. This is something that an organism has left behind. So footprints are a really beautiful example of a trace fossil. Sometimes they leave burrows or other structures that they've made. And one really helpful fossil, trace fossil, is called a coprolite. So that's a really fancy scientific term for poop or scat. So that's what these are right here. So these are mineralized pieces of scat. And this can tell us a lot of information about an organism. We can dig into that and figure out what it was eating, the size, all kinds of things these different fossils can tell us. Okay, so the fossil record goes back billions of years. And one of the coolest things that we saw kind of as we're thinking about the history of the Earth is this huge expansion in diversity. So when we think about how long there's been life on Earth, we can slice that time up into different pieces. So we can think about the history of life in periods of a few 100 million years each or so. And when we get to the Cambrian period, we see this transition from unicellular organisms for the most part. There might have been some algal plant-like things starting to aggregate, but on the whole, single cells. And in a relatively short period of time, over 50 million years, we see this explosion of diversity. So that's what this image depicts right here. We went from single-celled organisms to things that look like jellyfish, almost to the modern day, things with exoskeletons, things with complex body parts, sponges, anemone-like things. So we see this huge transition over a relatively short amount of time, and we call that the Cambrian Explosion. And so these are the actual fossils that represent organisms from this time period. So this one is called Hallucigenia, some wacky things with spiky-like structures, Amylocaris. I didn't notice this 1 centimeter. So some of them were quite small. They weren't gigantic organisms yet, but a really amazing diversity of creatures. And so there's not something that looks like this today, right? So things change over time, but there's also events in history that are opposite to these explosions. So in addition to having big blooms of diversity, having lots of different species emerge, we have periods of extinction or decreases in diversity. And so the definition of a mass extinction event is if we lose 60% of existing species over a period of about 1 million years. So that seems like a huge window of time, but when we look back on the history of life on Earth, it's a relatively short period of time. So in contrast to the Cambrian explosion, we have several mass extinction events. And so here in these colored bars are those different periods of time that I mentioned. So these are those individual slices of the history of life on Earth. So in this one, we're starting about 540 million years ago. That was the beginning of the Cambrian period. So it was during this time that we see that explosion of different life forms. And as we look through the fossil record, we can keep track of how many species we see, if things disappear, if things expand and diverge, and what that means as we go along. So on this axis right here, we see the percentage of families that have gone extinct. So family in this case isn't like your nuclear family, your parents, your siblings. Family in evolutionary terms is a specific group of things. So it's a level of groupings above species, above genus, that includes an umbrella of diversity. So 60% of species have to go extinct for each mass extinction event. And so within this percentage of families, there are many, many, many species. And so if we see this red spike, that means that we've experienced an extinction event. And so when we look back through the fossil record, we can see 5 distinct mass extinction events. And based on what we know about species diversity now, unfortunately, we're on the edge of a sixth. More on that in a couple of slides. So as we're looking at these different peaks, the one that stands out the most is this one labeled End Permian Extinction. So this one happened, as the name suggests, at the end of the Permian period. So more than 90% of all of the species on Earth died in this mass extinction event. And the best possible explanation for why this event occurred was this huge release of methane from the ocean floor, coupled with as a result of a huge increase in volcanic activity. And so that's a problem because as volcanoes erupt, it releases all of this ash and dust into the atmosphere, and that will linger for a long time. And so if there's ash and dust, it's blocking the sunlight, right? So photosynthetic organisms aren't going to do well. Lots of things depend on photosynthetic organisms. It's going to change the temperature in a lot of places on Earth and lead to drastic change in the climate. And so this happened so fast, or at least was sustained for long enough that a lot of the organisms couldn't cope, and 90% of them went extinct. Okay, so that was the most drastic. So one you're probably more familiar with is the End Cretaceous extinction. So at the end of the Cretaceous period, there was an event most likely caused by a huge asteroid that impacted the Earth in the Yucatan Peninsula, the modern-day place near Mexico. So that huge asteroid impacted the Earth and sent off this huge chain of events that led to the extinction of most of the dinosaurs. And so I say most, but there were a couple survivors. So here is a phylogeny, a tree of various dinosaur species, the ones that we've been able to suss out. And if we look at this one down here, I don't know what animal this reminds you of, but it reminds me of a chicken or some kind of bird. And so that makes sense because this group is called Avialae. Avialae. So avian, bird-like. So let's go to the next slide. So all birds living today are descendants of that one group of dinosaurs, the Avialae dinosaurs. And we know this because, in addition to other recent discoveries, the first kind of confirmation we had was this fossil called Archaeopteryx. So we call this a transitional fossil because this was most likely on that lineage leading to modern-day birds. So this is something that looked like a dinosaur but had feathers and may have been able to fly. We're not quite sure. So any bird you hear or see or interact with today is a descendant of that dinosaur lineage. Okay, so not everything went extinct, but there was quite a huge bottleneck. So we no longer see most dinosaurs alive today because a lot of them died out during that End Cretaceous extinction. So there have been 5 due to a lot of things that humans especially have done in the recent past. It looks like we're on the verge of our 6th. Again, based on that metric of losing 60% of the species on the planet today. So there's lots of things that contribute to extinction: poaching, killing animals for trophies or medicine or food, pollution, extracting minerals from the earth, fracking, mining. All of these processes really disrupt ecosystems and can put lots of species on the bridge of extinction. One of the biggest is getting rid of habitat. So if you are a species that relies on a certain tree and you cut down all those trees, you have nowhere else to go. And so lots of species go extinct because of habitat loss. And now climate change is impacting a lot of species. So huge fluctuations in temperature, things in general are getting really hot. If things live kind of on the tops of mountains, there's nowhere for them to go. So a lot of evidence is feeding into this idea, this hypothesis, that we're starting another mass extinction event. So on that note, thinking about the fossil record, we've learned a lot from the past. We can use certain information to come up with an explanation for how things are related. And that's what a phylogeny is. So the best explanation for what a phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a group of organisms. We can represent that with a phylogenetic tree. This is a really beautiful example of a phylogenetic tree. This is from your book, by the way. So again, check this out if you need help with your presentation. Another way to think of a phylogeny is as a hypothesis. Right? So we can't go back in time. We can't actually observe these speciation events. We can take different types of data and combine them and come up with a best explanation of how things are related. And that's what a phylogenetic tree is. So if you've seen papers or books or sources that have different trees, so your group might be in one place and then in a different paper it's in another, that's just because those are different hypotheses of how things are related, and that's totally valid. Okay. So we're going to continue with this idea and learn about what goes into a tree, what the different pieces are, and how we make them. So one of those vocabulary words is a root. Right? So trees have roots that anchor them into the ground. A phylogenetic tree has a root, and that represents the common ancestor of all of the organisms depicted in this tree. So we can take any of these nematodes, for example. We can trace them back to each individual speciation event, and go all the way back to the common ancestor. Right? So this group, this branch leads to all of the rest. So the root of our tree represents the common ancestor of everything in this tree. Those lines that connect the individual organisms are called branches. So along the line with this tree metaphor, root is the common ancestor, and branches represent the lines that connect these different speciation events. Okay. And then something that is probably not part of the tree that you're used to is a node. So a node on a phylogenetic tree represents those speciation events. So at each node, at each kind of split right here, we see populations of organisms that have diverged from one another. So nodes are those sites of speciation. And then the last main vocabulary word for parts of trees is called an outgroup. So an outgroup is kind of what it sounds like. It's the outermost group of organisms in your tree. So this is the group that's equally related to the rest of your tree. It's directly connected to the root here. So there's one speciation event that separates sponges in this phylogeny from the rest of the animals here. Okay, so your outgroup has the least in common with all of these. So all of these organisms have more in common with each other than they do with sponges. Okay, so we started thinking about this idea in the speciation lecture, but we're going to expand it a little bit. So a monophyletic group, mono means one, monophyly, kind of one leaf. Monophyletic group is a group of organisms descended from one common ancestor. So if we have these imaginary organisms, A through F, and I'm thinking about putting them in different groups, and I say ABC is one group, we can look at that on the tree, and ABC is monophyletic, right? So we can take ABC and trace them back to one node, one speciation event, right here. So one common ancestor and all of its descendants. So if we are making another group, we decide to only put B and C together. So maybe we've named a species or a group and we've only included these. If we make a phylogenetic tree, that group is now paraphyletic. So paraphyly just means that we've grouped these organisms with one common ancestor, but we haven't included all of its descendants, right? So A is missing, even though it has a common ancestor with B and C. So in this example, B and C is a paraphyletic group. So these terms refer to groups in reference to their evolutionary history. So paraphyly, one common ancestor and not all of its descendants. Polyphyly similar idea, but a little bit different. Instead of B and C, we've decided now to have A, B, and D be one group together. But this group doesn't reflect its evolutionary history because A and B have a common ancestor with C, and that's not included. And D over here has more speciation events in between it and everything in the group. So this then represents two different common ancestors and not all of its descendants. So poly, many common ancestors. So this group is polyphyletic because it spans those two speciation events, those two common ancestors. For A, B, and D to be a monophyletic group, we would need to include all of these organisms, because the most recent common ancestor between A, B, and D includes A through F. Okay, so this vocabulary is just in case you came upon these in your research. I had a couple questions on what these meant. Hopefully this made it a little bit more clear. Okay, so we're transitioning from talking about what makes up trees to how we put them together. And one of the main ideas for how to arrange things on a tree is this idea of parsimony. So all parsimony means is that the simplest explanation is probably the most correct. So if we look at a series of traits, there's many different ways we can hypothesize that they arose, but the most likely explanation is the fewest changes. So in this example right here, we have this group of hummingbirds. One lineage has blue feathers, and two lineages have red feathers. So you can come up with lots of different ways for how this might have come about. So in this case, we're guessing that maybe red feathers evolved twice. But because these are closely related, there's only one speciation event. The more likely explanation is that red feathers just evolved once. So we can place it on here in between these two speciation events, these two nodes. So this is the most parsimonious explanation, and so that's how we would show it on our tree. So this would have been a fun activity to do in class, but for the sake of our lecture, we'll just walk through it step by step. So we can build a tree based on trait information, and we can use this idea of parsimony to come up with a good explanation. And so we're looking at this group of 5 organisms: lampreys, antelopes, bald eagles, alligators, and sea bass. So very different organisms and very different groups, but how are they related to one another? So you might have some guesses just based on what they look like. So lampreys are in the ocean, so is sea bass, they might be a group. Antelopes and alligators both have 4 legs, they might be a group. There's lots of different ways we can make guesses about how close they are. But one way to come up with a very good hypothesis is to look at some traits. So we've chosen these traits that will be helpful in describing their pattern of evolution. So we looked at the presence or absence of lungs, jaws, feathers, gizzards, and fur. So if there's a 0, it means this organism does not have that trait. If there's a plus, it means it does. So antelopes have lungs, jaws, and fur. They do not have feathers or gizzards. So we can use this information to come up with an explanation of how they're related. So the first step is to identify that outgroup, right? The one that was equally related to everything else. So when we look at our chart, we see that lampreys don't have any of these traits that we're looking at. So we can safely draw them off to the side. These are equally related to everything else. There's no characteristics that unite them with anything over here. Excuse me. Okay, so we found our outgroup. And we can find a trait that unites all of these together. When we look across here, there's one thing that they all share, and that is this trait, jaws. So they all have some kind of jaw. So we can draw that right here on our tree. So sometime around here, jaws arose. And the common ancestor that had jaws gave rise to all of these other animals. And we can kind of use the same logic to go through and figure out the relationships between these. So what's that next trait that one of these organisms does not have and the rest do? Well, we can look here on our chart. And so jaws, we figured out where that is. And the next traits, let's see. Lampreys are outside. Lungs, only 3 of the 4 of our organisms have lungs. So that's the next organism we can draw. So sea bass are over here. They have jaws, but they don't have lungs. And so that separates them from these other groups. So sea bass then are equally related to antelopes, bald eagles, and alligators. Okay, so now we're down to 3 groups. How do we divide these up? Well, what's the one trait that 2 of these have and not the other one? That is a gizzard. So we can draw antelopes out next, equally related to bald eagles and alligators. And so this is the best approximation of these organisms. So we've used the traits, the information to figure out who's related to who. But there's a couple of traits we haven't put on here yet, and that is fur and feathers. So because only one organism has this, we put them on that branch that goes to that organism. So even though alligators and bald eagles share this trait, only bald eagles have feathers, and so that separates bald eagles from the rest of these organisms. Okay, so these kind of traits are special because they are able to distinguish one group from the rest. So those are derived traits. So when we're thinking about what traits we can use to build trees, we want to use derived traits. So every species has a mix of things that are ancestral and things that are derived. So we inherit things from our common ancestors, and if they haven't changed very much, we call that an ancestral trait. If they have changed a lot over time, we call that a derived trait. So if we go back to this tree, when we're looking at antelope specifically, fur is a derived trait. Lungs and jaws are an ancestral trait. They've inherited them from their ancestors. Okay. So again, species have this different mix of ancestral traits and derived traits. So thinking of a specific example, in humans, having 5 fingers and having 5 toes is an ancestral trait. So when we look back through the tree of life, mammals, a lot of mammals, even things like reptiles, have 5 fingers and 5 toes. So it arose early in vertebrate evolution. So for humans, having 5 fingers is an ancestral trait. Hasn't changed a lot over time. A derived trait for human beings is our large brain size. So this is a cool image of different primates next to each other. So even though we're closely related, you can see by the size of the skull, human brains relatively are larger than other primates. And so we can draw this trait on that branch leading to humans that differentiates us from other primates. Another word for traits that separate individual groups is called a synapomorphy. Syn just means together. Apo means descended from. So a synapomorphy is a trait that a group of organisms has descended from. It can separate different groups. It shows a monophyletic group. So kind of combining different words we've learned this lecture, synapomorphy is a unique trait that is derived, so changed over time, shared within a monophyletic group. So one common ancestor and all of its descendants. We can draw a synapomorphy on the branch right here. So these traits are really helpful for people that are classifying different organisms. It lends a lot of evidence that we have a good group based on evolutionary history. So a specific example of a human synapomorphy is the evolution of hair. So this separates mammals from other organisms It's a monophyletic group because it's one common ancestor and the rest of its descendants. And not just gains of things, but also losses. So loss of a tail is a synapomorphy for humans and great apes. Okay, so that's a specific example of what this term is. These are helpful when we're building trees. So traits are helpful, but sometimes traits can also mislead our sense of evolutionary history. So convergence, this idea of similar traits arising not from common ancestry. So this is when traits don't lead us to a representation of the ancestral history of these groups. So specifically, convergent evolution is the process by which similar traits develop in things that are not closely related. And this is usually due to environmental pressures. So a similar environment can drive the evolution of certain traits. So we can have two ancestral groups here that evolve a similar morphology, even if they don't have one common ancestor. So an example of convergent evolution is this ichthyosaur, this mammal, this dolphin, and this shark. They're in three different groups of organisms, but they have a very similar body type. And so that's an example of convergence. The streamlined body type and this lighter color on the bottom and darker color on the top, those are traits that are helpful when you live in water. They're not indicative of their shared evolutionary history. So if you want more information on that, please see figure 25.3. And so synapomorphies referred to monophyletic groups. Convergent evolution can lead to homoplasy. So a trait that is homoplasious, plastic plasy refers to its flexible nature. Homoplasy refers to convergent evolution, traits that are shared, not based on evolutionary similarity. So the traits we want to use to build a tree do reflect phylogenetic, do reflect evolutionary history, and we call these homologous traits. So if you've seen this image before, this represents our kind of shared inheritance of this arm and limb structure. This arm, leg, hand, bone structure is a homologous trait because we've inherited it from common ancestry. All right, so I want to end this lecture on kind of the overall importance. So thinking about phylogenetics is helpful for this class, but beyond this class, knowledge of and appreciation of phylogenies is super important for lots of different reasons. So it's important for classification. So knowing who's related to who is helpful, not just to know the answer, but when we're thinking about conservation, right? So we're thinking about extinction events to save species, it's helpful to know where to send specific resources. So there's not a whole lot of money out there for conservation. We need to figure out kind of how to triage, how to organize who needs what resources. We can use trees to figure out who's related to who, figure out the diversity of these organisms. Very appropriate for the time we're in. Phylogenies can identify pathogens, but it can also help track the spread of certain pathogens. So we can find sequences and make trees, viruses and bacteria, and track where they're coming from, so we can use that information to stop their spread. Kind of along that idea, we can use it for forensics as well. There was a really famous case of a doctor who intentionally injected HIV into his ex-wife, and at the trial, they were able to use evidence for someone who knew how to make a phylogenetic tree, and they showed that the HIV virus in the victim matched the evolutionary history of patients that the doctor took care of. So they were able to use phylogenetics and evolution as evidence in a trial. Okay, so beyond just answering biological questions, knowledge of phylogenetics is important for lots of things. And so with that, once you feel comfortable with this information. I hope it's been helpful for your projects. Go ahead and take the phylogeny quiz. So it's going to be the same format as the previous ones, 10 questions, 2 points each, and you'll have that score right away. And then one more note before we leave. If you feel like you're trapped inside and need something to do, there are a few excellent books that are kind of on topic with what we talked about today. So Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin is an excellent kind of account of our evolution over time by a paleontologist who discovered a really important fossil. T-Rex in the Crater of Doom by Walter Alvarez discusses the evidence of that asteroid impact and how it led to that big extinction event. And then The Sixth Extinction, an Unnatural History by Elizabeth Colbert talks about the evidence for this new era that we're entering. Okay, so with that, that's all the information I have. Please let me know if there's any questions. If you haven't gotten an email already, that will be coming soon about what to do this week, what's coming up. And keep in touch. I really like hearing from you. So I hope you're doing well. Please stay healthy and safe. And I'll see you via this lecture next week.